Shackleton's expedition was meant to be the greatest triumph to cross Antarctica via the South Pole. But the Endurance was crushed by ice, and the dream turned into a fight for survival. Where glory had fallen, another challenge was born. To save the crew at any cost, 7 days of hell in open boats, an impossible trek across mountains, and a miraculous rescue. Their story became not a conquest of a continent, but a legend of human endurance. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world was gripped by a thirst for discovery. The blank spots on the map had become arenas for national prestige. The South Pole was the ultimate prize. In the year 1911, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen was the first to reach it, followed closely by Briton Robert Scott, who perished on the return journey along with his entire team. For Britain, it was a blow below the belt. National pride demanded a comeback. And so, a new goal was born: to cross Antarctica from coast to coast, proving the British were still capable of the impossible. Ernest Shackleton was the man who dared to challenge the continent. He already had expeditions under his belt, a knighthood, and the status of a national hero, but he also carried debts, towering ambition, and a constant hunger for recognition. He was a charismatic leader who could inspire men, but just as much, he craved glory, fortune, and redemption for Britain's loss in the race to the pole. This expedition was his chance and his final gamble with fate. The mission was audacious: to cross Antarctica for the first time, passing through the South Pole. No one had even dared to try. It was the last unconquered frontier, a ticket to immortality. But the dream came with a price tag of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Shackleton had to cobble together funding from investors, the government, and by pre-selling everything he could: books, photographs, and a future film. Even then, it was clear: great ventures thrive not only on ideas, but on the spectacle surrounding them. He recruited his crew through a now legendary newspaper ad. According to legend, the text read like a dare: hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. The risk drew thousands, 5,000 applications for just 27 spots. The chosen included sailors, officers, a doctor, a photographer, and even a meteorologist, not only skilled, but mentally tough individuals. And then came a surprise. A young stowaway named Perce Blackborough was found hidden in the hold. Instead of punishing him, Shackleton kept the boy on, joking that in case of famine, he's first on the menu. The incident became a symbol of the absurd twists yet to come. At the heart of the expedition was the ship Endurance. Built in Norway, it was specially designed for icy conditions and looked indestructible. Its name, Endurance, embodied everything the crew hoped to rely on. It was a word of resolve, a vow to persevere. But even then, it carried a foreboding. The trials ahead would be far worse than they imagined. In August 1914, even as Europe was already ablaze with the First World War, the expedition set out. Their last stop was South Georgia Island, where whalers warned them the ice was impassable, Antarctica was closed off. Shackleton ignored the warning. He was pressed for time, money, and driven by ambition. He took the risk, and that decision became the first mistake, triggering a chain of looming disasters. Thus began an expedition meant to symbolize courage and ambition. Shackleton appeared both hero and adventurer, a man willing to challenge not just nature, but fate itself. Endurance became a symbol of faith in technology and willpower, but even then, behind that symbol lurked the coming trials. From the very start, the story was defined by its core themes: dream versus reality, ambition versus survival, man versus the elements. An expedition conceived as a heroic feat gradually turned into a fight for survival, and this is where the first illusions crumbled. In February 1915, Endurance tried to make its way to the Antarctic coast, but became firmly trapped in the ice of the Weddell Sea. One crew member described it like this: "We're stuck like an almond in chocolate," and the comparison proved hauntingly accurate. The cause of the entrapment was the absence of the usual southern wind that typically pushed ice fields apart in summer. Instead, northern winds compressed the ice even more, locking the ship in a tightening grip. The crew didn't view it as a catastrophe, they saw it as just another challenge, confident that if they waited out the winter, the ice would release them in spring. Half a year passed aboard the drifting ship, and life on Endurance settled into a peculiar rhythm. The men hunted seals, replenishing meat and blubber stores, while the freezing temperatures turned the deck into a natural refrigerator. To maintain morale, they organized games, football on the ice, card matches, and bridge, to read books, and staged group pranks, including a mass head shaving. Even in the heart of the frozen wilderness, they celebrated holidays. On June 22nd, the midpoint of winter, they held a costume feast, toasting families and loved ones. Spirits remained relatively high, and Shackleton vigilantly ensured that discipline and morale never faltered. But in autumn 1915, the ice showed who truly ruled the story. By October, the pressure became so intense that the ship's hull groaned and began to deform. The creaking of timber was relentless, day and night. Endurance started to list, and on October 27th, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The crew hauled out tents, supplies, dogs, and 3 lifeboats, setting up camp on the ice. By late November, the ship sank completely, a heavy psychological blow. For many, it was the last thread connecting them to civilization. Life now continued on a drifting ice floe in the middle of the ocean. The camp was made of tents, lifeboats, and crates of gear. Food supplies were limited, and once again, seal and penguin hunting became the primary source of sustenance. Temperatures hovered around minus 22 degrees Celsius. They brushed their teeth with snow, and breakfast might include seal steaks, a bit of porridge or canned food, and tea with biscuits. Dinner was stewed meat or cocoa. Evenings were for social life. Meteorologist Hussey played the banjo. There were card games and conversations in the tents, though talk of women was taboo, too painful a reminder of the warmth of home. Problems mounted. Clothing and sleeping bags were constantly damp with nowhere to dry them. Sanitary conditions deteriorated, and fatigue and exhaustion grew. Shackleton understood. The real enemy was not the cold or even hunger. It was demoralization. He imposed a strict routine and grouped people in tents, not by rank, but by psychological compatibility to minimize conflict. He personally monitored morale and involved everyone in daily rituals to preserve the illusion of normalcy and ward off despair. In spring 1916, a decision was made to proceed on foot. The goal? To reach the edge of the ice sheet and get to open water. Calculations promised about 300 kilometers of travel, but the reality was a disaster. After several days, they had covered only 15 kilometers, a shocking realization. The snow was too soft, the ice ridges too high, and the heavy sledges and boats unbearably difficult to move. The attempt made one thing clear: they were entirely dependent on the ice flow's drift and nature's mercy. The realization of their helplessness hit the crew like a psychological avalanche, and fully transformed the expedition from a scientific endeavor into a desperate struggle for basic survival. At that moment, the dream of crossing Antarctica crumbled. Triumph gave way to survival on the ice, and Shackleton's main goal was no longer to conquer a continent, but to save his men. A new mission was born in this story, not glory, but the hope of rescue and making it home alive. When all plans collapse and hope for a quick escape fades, a time of ultimate trials begins. The winter of 1915 to 1916 tested the expedition to its very core. Hunger, cold, and dwindling resources turned life on the ice floe into a torment. Rations were only sufficient for a few more months, and the crew had to cut them daily to stretch them as long as possible. The primary food became seal and penguin meat, rich in fat and calories, but so monotonous that it led to digestive issues and overall physical decline. One of the most painful moments came when Shackleton ordered the shooting of around 50 dogs. He understood that sleds were no longer viable, and there was simply no food left for the animals. Some of the dogs were later eaten. Although many accepted the necessity, it was still experienced as a tragedy. One crew member bitterly remarked, "Hunger makes a man an animal," a statement that perfectly captured the atmosphere in the camp. In constant cold and damp conditions, illness and exhaustion became the norm. Frostbite was common. Clothes were always wet and never fully dried. Engineer Thomas Ord Lees rationed food so strictly that he sometimes collapsed from weakness. Tempers frayed, and arguments became more frequent as fatigue gnawed at everyone's patience. First Officer Greenstreet once broke into tears over a spilled cup of powdered milk. Every gram of food had become that precious. Even boredom turned into an enemy. Books and games lost their charm. Hussey's banjo no longer lifted spirits, and the playing cards had been used so much that their faces wore off. Psychologically, the mood swung between fleeting hope and creeping despair as more and more men realized their fate now rested entirely in the hands of nature. By spring 1916, the situation had reached a breaking point. The ice floe beneath their camp began to crack, posing a real threat of losing all supplies. Shackleton gave the urgent order to move tents and boats to more stable ice. The camp shrank to a tiny area. On April 9th, he made a fateful decision to abandon the floe and set out to sea in the 3 lifeboats, though it meant facing even more dangerous trials. Thus began 7 days of hell on the open ocean. The sea met them with freezing spray, relentless waves, and snow. Their legs were constantly submerged in water, clothes soaked through instantly, and fresh water was critically scarce. The ice they once melted was now gone. They ate raw meat that only worsened their thirst, and dehydration became a constant threat. One man fell overboard, and his clothing froze solid almost immediately. With no ice left, they had to sleep inside the lifeboats, tied together, moving their limbs in their sleep to keep them from freezing. Every day was a battle with death, but the goal remained: reach land. In April 1916, the crew finally reached Elephant Island. It was a moment they had awaited for a year and a half. For the first time in 500 days, they felt solid ground beneath their feet. Many drank glacial meltwater, ate until they collapsed, and slept for nearly 24 hours straight. But joy quickly gave way to harsh reality. The island was brutally inhospitable. Constant winds and freezing temperatures made life miserable. Their chosen camp was frequently flooded by storms. There were penguins and seals to eat, but no real conditions for long-term survival. Health rapidly declined. Engineer Rickinson suffered a heart attack. Blackborough was developing gangrene in his foot, and everyone was on the brink of collapse. Shackleton realized staying meant slow death. With no hope of rescue, he bet everything on the impossible: to send a small group for help to South Georgia Island, over 1,000 kilometers away, across the Southern Ocean and the infamous Drake Passage, known as the Sailor's Graveyard. The rescue party included Shackleton himself, navigator Frank Worsley, and 4 of the strongest men. The remaining 22 stayed behind on Elephant Island. This was not about heroism for glory, it was a desperate attempt to save his men. He risked his life so that they all might have a chance to go home. The winter and spring of 1916 marked a moment of ultimate exhaustion, when hunger, cold, illness, and hopelessness pushed the crew to the very edge. And yet they continued to fight. The greatest challenge was not just the elements, it was resisting despair. By the end of this chapter, the expedition was no longer a scientific mission. It had become a story of sacrifice and the burden of leadership, with Shackleton betting everything to save his team. The expedition was not in reaching the South Pole or crossing Antarctica. It was in Shackleton's ability to preserve the life of every single member of his team. To rescue the men left behind on Elephant Island, he made a desperate decision: to cross the Southern Ocean in a small boat. They chose the sturdiest lifeboat, the James Caird, which Carpenter McNish reinforced with wooden planks and sealing tar. A crew of six set out. Shackleton, his navigator Frank Worsley, seaman Thomas Crean, sailors John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy, and McNish himself. Worsley had only a sextant and a watch, and with the sun often hidden behind clouds, any miscalculation could have been fatal. The sea greeted them with storms and waves, towering up to 18 meters. Freezing spray turned their clothes to ice. The boat was constantly tossed or plunged into troughs, forcing them to alternate between rowing and hoisting the sail. Their food ran out quickly, water had to be collected from rain and melted ice, but thirst and mouth ulcers tormented them. Strength was fading, but faith in Shackleton held them together. He kept repeating that each day brought them closer to salvation. In April 1916, they reached South Georgia, but landed on the wrong side of the island. Sailing around it was impossible, so 3 of them, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean, resolved to cross the mountains on foot. With no maps and hardly any rest, they marched for 36 hours straight, scaling glaciers and descending sheer cliffs. Later, Shackleton confessed that throughout the journey, he felt the presence of a 4th man, an invisible companion, walking beside them. At last, they arrived at the whaling station Stromness, and for the first time in months, they heard a bell ring and human voices. Shackleton immediately began organizing the rescue of the others, but ice surrounding Elephant Island turned back 3 rescue attempts. Each time, he returned empty-handed, yet swore he would not stop until he brought his men home. Finally, on the 4th attempt, on August 30th, 1916, he succeeded. The Chilean vessel Yelcho reached the island, and all 22 men, exhausted but alive, ran to meet it. Not a single life was lost. The end of a 20-month ordeal marked the beginning of a legend. They had not crossed the continent or reached the pole, but they had achieved something greater. They had saved lives. At the time, the world barely noticed their feat, preoccupied with the First World War. But later, their story became a symbol of endurance. Shackleton gave lectures, wrote books, and the expedition entered history as the greatest survival odyssey. In 1921, he set off for Antarctica once more, but a year later, he died of a heart attack off the coast of South Georgia and was buried there, in the land where his greatest triumph had ended. The voyage across the ocean, the crossing of the mountains, and the rescue of the crew became the climax of this saga. Shackleton proved that leadership is not about ambition. It is about responsibility for those who follow you. And that is why the Endurance Expedition remains forever a symbol of courage, solidarity, and belief in the value of human life.